Okay, everybody, we're ready to get started with our first panel of the morning. This morning we're going to hear about oil and gas development in the urban landscape, and specifically how the new Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's large urban mitigation area local government consultation rule is working out. So we've got some folks with a lot of experience with that. And with that, I would like to introduce Greg Deranleau, the environmental manager for the COGCC, Troy Swain, oil and gas liaison with Weld County, Tamra Allen, formerly planning manager with Garfield County and soon to be community development director with the city of Grand Junction, and Jamie Jost with Jost Energy Law. And with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
Great, thank you, Kirby. Just as a way of introduction, I think we can't talk about the large urban mitigation area facility rules without a little bit of background and talking about the Governor's Task Force of 2014. So I'm going to introduce a little bit of background with a brief slide presentation. Then I'll, just as far as how we're going to manage this panel, I'll let each of our speakers kind of give a brief introduction to how the large urban mitigation area facility rules are envisioned by them, and I won't say quite working for them because the rules are really still in their infancy. And you'll see that over and over as we're talking, that really these rules, we've yet to see them really come to their full fruition. And then we'll go back and forth with some questions, and I would like to invite you all, especially local governments, to ask questions. Raise your hand during our discussion so that we could get your questions answered as we go through. So the Governor's Task Force was established by order of the Governor in late 2014, and it was really the primary goal was to tease out a way to have local governments more involved in the permitting process, give them a seat at the table in the oil and gas permitting process, especially with a focus of larger facilities that we were seeing especially in the Front Range, coming closer to residential communities. So that was just a flashpoint issue that really the governor felt strongly needed to have direct action taken. So 21 members he assigned to this panel. They met 7 times. They met throughout the state. They received input from a wide variety of stakeholders. And at the end of their meetings, the Governor's Task Force came up with 36 recommendations that, of those 36 recommendations that were put forward, 9 of them received a consensus vote, 2/3 support, and were adopted by the Commission in February of 2015. 7 of those recommendations pertained to the COGCC, and 2 of them required rulemaking. And one of those was Recommendation 17. And Recommendation 17 required COGCC to engage in a rulemaking process in which we defined large-scale facilities, oil and gas facilities, in urban mitigation areas and develop a process by which local governments could become engaged in that permitting process. And also it's talked about best management practices and mitigation measures for those. This panel, I think we're not going to spend a lot of time on the mitigation piece of it. We're really going to talk about that consultation process and the planning process and that engagement. So COGCC followed that up with several months of stakeholder engagement. Again, statewide, we met with local governments, we met with citizens to bring their concerns and their input into those. What is a large facility? How big? Of course, citizens' view of what a large facility is and industry's view of what a large facility is weren't quite on the same page. So, pulling all those things together and trying to find some consensus ideas. That rulemaking process ultimately concluded in February 2016 when our large urban mitigation area rules were adopted. And we did define a large urban mitigation area facility. And here the definition, a new definition in our rules. it's predicated on it is in an urban mitigation area, which was something we already defined, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But 8 or more new wells or 4,000 barrels of oil storage cumulative. So if you are adding to a facility that had 2,000 barrels and you add another 2,000 barrels, then you are reaching that threshold. With the idea that operators could put, wells in close if they move the production off site, which some operators were proactively doing, and move that production facility farther away. So the rules require an operator to seek agreement on the siting of a large urban mitigation area facility 90 days prior to submitting their applications to us. And then it also does provide, again, the best management practices. Just so everybody has a vision of what an urban mitigation area looks like, 11 houses within a half-circle radius around an oil and gas location, a half-circle radius of 1,000 feet, or 22 building units all the way around, if you look all the way around. And these folks here, they probably don't consider themselves urban dwellers, right? They've got a view of some wide open agricultural fields. From the state's perspective, this location is in an urban mitigation area. And so I'll leave it at that as a way of introduction, and then I'll go ahead and ask each of our panelists here to kind of talk about what the LUMA process, or large urban mitigation area facility process, means, if you will, to them, and how it might interact with the local land use processes, and what benefits and what challenges you might see. So I'll turn that over to you, Troy.
Okay, thank you. The county recently adopted a code change. We call it a Weld oil and gas location assessment. Prior to that, the only locations that went through a formal review process were the very few that were located in our residential zone district. So now we actually look at every location on a formal basis, and we can make a determination whether or not this location would go through an administrative process and be approved by the Director of Planning, or it would go to the Board of County Commissioners for approval. So again, that allows us by code to, where in the past we were used by right, to look at every location and then pull locations that are warranted by their complexity or other issues, and put those before the elected officials, where we would have a notification by newspaper, posting of the property, and a hearing process. Our informal process has a very robust notice process, and we also notice neighboring local governments that could be close enough to the location or close enough to a feature of the location. So how does it dovetail with the LUMA process? Well, the LUMA process says, operator, go notice and consult with the local government. Well, you could go through our process prior to or concurrent with the state's process. I think it's yet to be said how it's going to work out. And I can give a few examples of some of the ones that we've had so far, but I'd like to turn it over to the other folks here.
Before you do, Troy, I guess on that dovetailing, does the operator's 90-day notice that's required under our rule, how does that coincide with the local land use processes? I mean, would that be the initiation of their WOGLA process with you? Could it be?
It could. They could give the initial notice under the WOGLA at the same time that they give us that 90 days. Even if it went through a more formal process, you could probably get through that process within the 90 days. The administrative process, if you have all your legwork done on the front end and you've done your notice, that could actually occur in a 45-day period, as long as you went through our comment period is about 28 days. You addressed any comments that were received, and we were comfortable with approving that administratively. So far, we've, when we were kind of in a gray area of adopting our new regulation, we told the operators it might be best to just time us out at the 30 days with no response. And then you'll go through our process when you're actually ready to move forward. We had one in an industrial area near the JBS beef plant. It got roped in just because of the size of the commercial buildings. We had met with Greeley, we had met with the operator. It was an industrial area and it would have been a use by right in the past. So they'll be getting a WOGLA for that. We call it a WOGLA. We always got to have abbreviations for that. The other one was an industrial area in the old Kodak property in Windsor, but it was an unincorporated Weld. In that situation, the operator was reapplying because they were making changes to the site, and they were actually lowering the intensity of the site because they were going to serve, the crude was going to be taken off by pipeline. So the number of crude tanks dropped dramatically. The truck traffic's going to be gone on that aspect of the operation. So that one already had a permit. We have a provision in our rule for if you don't increase over a certain size of an existing facility, you don't need to go through the WOGLA. So in that case, they will already have the local government approval because the new site is less intense, but they made the change after the commission's rule had changed. And then I think we got one with a well pad that has enough wellheads to qualify as a LUMA, but all the features of the project that have an impact, the tank battery, the access roads and all that, are way outside the
1,000 foot.
Yeah, that would notice the residents and where they'd have to have concerns. So like Greg said, it's very early in our process, it's very early in their process. These rule changes always have a grandfathering period, and they always have an implementation phase before you really start to see how they develop over time.
So let's turn to you, Tamra. How do you see the LUMA process interacting with the local land use process, and what challenges and benefits do you see?
There's a lot.
There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. I could probably spend the next hour talking about that. But let me set the stage a little bit for Garfield County. Is this on?
No.
That's better. So the stage in Garfield County is a little bit different from a regulatory aspect, and I think it's important to understand kind of where we're starting from. Oil and gas development, the drilling and production, historically has been a use by right in Garfield County, which means that there has been no county review and no action taken at any level of our local government to engage in the siting or other types of permitting activities related to the actual drilling and production sites, excluding one area, and that is our Battlement Mesa area, which is in a PUD that does require special use permitting to have oil and gas. And if you guys know this area at all, that's certainly kind of the hotbed of development right now. There's one operator that has a number of proposed pads in that area. So I think looking at the rule 305A poses some really interesting challenges for us at the county level because of this, I guess, inextricably linked connection between what finding agreement or seeking agreement requires from the regulations and a process that we have that travels very independently of this consultation. And let me just give it two examples here that I think highlight part of the challenge and perception from the county about how to make this consultation really an effective process, or try to at least get some the best result for the county from it. So we've had two consultations that have happened or are in process. The first one happening outside of the Battlement Mesa PUD. So this is an area where gas development in this area is a by right use. It was called the Lacey Park Pad. And they came in and they triggered this LUMA consultation because of its proximity to a school. The county chose to engage in that consultation, so they voluntarily said, yes, we are interested. But really under the auspice of saying, we want to kind of get the best result we can. We want to be engaged in the siting and the best management practices, but really on behalf of the school district because of the proximity to that school. Ultimately, the pad was withdrawn and the consultation process ended. However, the challenge I think therein is that had the county chosen to continue to play kind of this convener role in the consultation, there was no clear way for the county to say at the end of the day that we agree and we have found agreement on the specific site and best management practice that the rule requires. There's no kind of hearing process, there's no public engagement process, there's really nothing at the county level. So I think as this rule evolves and in the potentiality that we see more of these types of pads develop in around the county where it is a by right use, I think it's going to be a really interesting progression and evolution to see how the county in this scenario actually finds agreement. There is no structure for it. Certainly in the past, staff has not been the, I guess, the appropriate person or people to engage in this consultation or actually to be able to find agreement. And so ultimately how that is done, I think is really, yet to be determined. On the PUD side, in the Battlement Mesa area where a special use permit is required, it's a lot more simple. From the county standpoint, the consultation occurred, again, serving kind of a convener role, bringing out a number of entities, the COGCC, CDPHE, other kind of agencies throughout the county that would be integral in this. And ultimately, there was a walkthrough on the site really trying to talk about those issues that we saw would be help bring a better application to the county. However, we have a SUP process or special use permit process. And ultimately the county said we cannot find agreement until we go through this land use process. And so the 90 days or kind of the threshold set by COGC really become null and void in our, I think, eyes, because there is a much more extensive process that only at the end of that with the Board of County Commissioner decision can there actually be concurrence and agreement found.
Sure, and our rules actually allow for that process to be ongoing, provided that it's making headway towards an end. So
absolutely, I think that in those cases where there is a local land use process, the operators certainly need to be aware that I think that local land use process will continue to be the driver of those timelines, and certainly, at least from this county's perspective, the 90 days is will not happen.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. And Kirby, thank you so much for asking us to be here and be on this panel. I've been asked to provide kind of the industry operator perspective on the LUMA process. And I was a participant in the rulemaking and represented a trade association as this went through the process. I also represent industry operators in the local government realm and to see what we can do with respect to avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating even being in a LUMA area. From the industry perspective, the first thing I think that is looked at is there a way to actually avoid being in an urban mitigation area first? If they can't, they need to figure out what happens to minimize the impacts in that urban mitigation area and what we can do to mitigate that. So from the industry perspective, I think you can see that as we've heard Greg and Troy and Tamra speak, we have two masters. One is the COGCC, one is the local government. We also have a third master, and that I think is a very important piece of this, and that's the surface owner. As part of the LUMA process, the surface owner also has to be engaged. And before even a permit can be initiated to the COGCC, there's a 90-day period of notice. It's called the Notice of Intent to Construct a LUMA. And that Notice of Intent goes out to the local government as well as the surface owner. And by rule, an industry operator cannot finalize a location within a LUMA area, let's say, before that notice goes out and there's been this opportunity for consultation with the local government. The operators, can run into issues with that because in many instances there's already surface use agreements that allow for locations within certain areas. or they are in negotiations with surface owners, and those negotiations may be stalled or delayed because of the LUMA process, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we also have to remember that when we are in this consultation process as to a site within a LUMA area, within an urban mitigation area, we also have to bring surface owners to the table too. And so that's where I think from the industry perspective, there's just a lot of planning that has to go into a LUMA facility, which is likely why we haven't seen too many go through the state so far, just because there is an extraordinary amount of planning that has to occur even before that notice of intent to construct is sent to the local governments. The purpose of the LUMA rule was to provide collaboration, and I think that by the examples already given today, there is a lot of collaboration between industry, local governments, the COGCC, and others as they're proceeding through this kind of still new rulemaking, how it's going to apply, what process is going to occur, and that collaboration is going to continue to be a key component as we move forward with this rule. And I think with that, Greg, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. So with respect to the surface owners, does your engagement with the surface owner, how do you envision balancing that out and bringing them into that? I mean, where do they interject? Where, and maybe we can then go back over from the local government's perspective as dictating how a surface owner uses their land. You're not in a position necessarily to do that, but Jamie, how do you see that? How do you see that taking place?
Well, I think for my answer to that's very easy. We have to see it take place because it's required by the rule. It's required by the rule to provide that notice of intent to the surface owner. So if that surface owner takes the initiative or wants to interject itself and be involved in that consultation, it has the ability to do so from day one. And that's under the state rules.
But they want to get a surface use agreement, and you want to get a surface use agreement with them. So I think that conflict there, how do you see that playing out?
Right. Well, and I think it depends on the situation. In many instances, and then again, not in a LUMA situation, but just in general surface use agreement negotiation situations. The surface owner has private property rights, and that surface owner has the right to do what he or her wants on that property. If those property rights may be affected by the LUMA process, that surface owner may choose to say, we're going to hold up on actually executing a surface use agreement until we can engage in the local government consultation. Or they may say, nope, we're going to sign this, and you have the ability to utilize my property. You now just have to go, you as the operator now just have to go figure that out with your other two masters. Right. And so I think it really varies situation to situation.
Okay. And so Troy, when the surface owner is engaged, do you as the local government, you're looking at this as a land use perspective, do you feel that you have the ability to negotiate best management practices and things of that nature that would be affecting the use of their land?
Well, we expect that when the operator comes to us with their notice, and we require specific drawings and access roads drawings and such, equipment lists and all that, at that point they would have already went to the landowner and have come to an agreement on the site. So I think throughout the whole process, even with the LUMA process, with the state's process, you actually always have a proposed location until the time you get that 2A and you get whatever local government approval you need to construct the site. So I don't think you ever agree on a final location, but I think through this process they're agreeing and proposing a final location, a final proposed location. So then part of the hard part about trying to get these things cited is people do need to keep in mind that it's not your property. So if you're the local government or you're a neighbor within a certain radius and all that, any kind of special mitigation that you end up agreeing on later with the operator has to be agreed to by the property owner. So if you want to put trees or a berm or something like that, that property owner can say, no, I don't want it there. Then you'll have to come up with an alternative proposal to meet the same issue. So again, the property owners, the primary person and the operator agreeing on a location that works for them, and then you do your further notice. You might have an issue with, hey, we're going to have to change an access or use a temporary access or something to accommodate maybe something that wasn't thought of, from the get-go. And I believe those are the type of things that can be identified and things that are actionable. You not existing is not something you're going to get very far with trying to work out. With us, the WOGLA itself, our new process, that is the county's agreeing on the siting. That's,
And I think that's helpful.
pretty much all I got.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we get a chance for questions from folks if they have them. So please, if you have questions, raise your hand, and I think we'll get a mic in your hand.
Let me throw in there, we had a grandfathering that if you applied for your 2A on or before February 1st, you didn't have to go through our process. We also had that ability to look at a change on a location and make a determination. Does this trigger a WOGLA or not based on the intensity? If it's actually going down, like the example I gave at that location on the old Kodak property, which on top of that was an industrial zone property, then we have the ability to not have that go through our process. But we've done 14 of these location assessments so far. Those 14 have been approved administratively, and in most of these they had waivers from the noticed property owners and also from the local governments, that we require notice to other local governments within 1,000 feet of the boundary of the location, the excavated area for.
And that's one thing we didn't talk a whole lot about, Troy, is the proximate local governments. And Jamie, maybe you could weigh in on how you feel the proximate local governments interplay with what the operator is doing in their planning process.
Well, again, in a LUMA situation, I don't think we've really had too much of that involvement, but the purpose of allowing notice to the proximate local governments was to get that input, was if the proximate local governments roads were going to be utilized or there were going to be other land use impacts as a result of that location, that input is necessary. And that's the collaborative effort, again, that was supported by the government's task force and really the purpose of the rule.
Sure.
But I think back to Troy's point, it's the consultation piece is meant to be very helpful and is not meant to delay. And so any comments from proximate local governments on we just don't want you here really aren't helpful to the process, because the process allows industry and the local governments and others to actually be there. But it truly is to allow what type of impacts and how they can be mitigated for that proximate local government.
Great. And we have a question.
One of the things you have not mentioned is the fourth element after the surface owners, local government, and the COGCC is the public. And I was wondering how the consultation process for LUMAs, what's your impressions on how the public gets involved, especially the homeowners who are affected by development?
Okay.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
We even before we adopted this county process, we had an informal review. We would look at all these drilling permits and tank battery permits, and if we were contacted by another local government or by homeowners in the area and they had some concerns that we can actually address, we would address those and work it out with the operator. We would facilitate a solution between the operator, ourselves, a neighboring local government, and try to address those concerns. Our process notice is limited to people within a certain proximity to the location, but we also have the latitude to include additional homeowners if your proximity to the haul route or proximity to the access road would make that site actually have a potential impact on you. We've done that in the past, even with the commission notice. Their notice is very specific based on a certain radius from equipment. We've seen situations where a haul road went right by somebody's home, so I just would contact the operator and say, you need to give these guys notice, you need to go out and talk to them, let them know what's going on, and do some sort of a mitigation measure if necessary. So we did all this informally. We adopted a formal process so we can flag controversial sites, put them through a robust notification and hearing process where we'll post the property, post in the newspaper, and also have a public hearing, written and verbal testimony given at those. But for the impact on a facility, I'm concerned with someone who's actually impacted. I'm not as concerned with somebody if you're a half a mile or a mile away, or if you have some philosophical opposition to the existence of oil and gas development. I don't see those comments as being germane to the situation.
Tamra, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that one.
Sure.
From Garfield County's perspective. Great question, Leslie, on that end. I think it's yet to unfold on how the public's role in the LUMA process takes place. I think by design, the regulation doesn't have a public input portion of it, but I think it is also open to each jurisdiction to kind of establish what is appropriate in the process of finding and seeking agreement for a site. Specifically here in Garfield County, I think the easy route for Garfield County, at least in the PUD, is that there is a special use permit process that travels, I think, hopefully concurrently or simultaneously with the LUMA consultation process. In that case, there is a very well-defined role for the public as far as when and how they engage through the public hearings, comments, attendance, and so forth. The flip side is when it is a by right use outside of the PUD, but still within Garfield County, what's that role of the public in finding and I guess seeking agreement on a site? And I think that's kind of yet to evolve. I think that's going to be left largely up to each local jurisdiction to figure out what that appropriate role is and who ultimately has the ability to kind of sign off on agreement at the end of the day if you don't have a structured land use process that LUMA facility is moving forward through.
And I'd just add that from the state's perspective, I mean, our expectation is that the local government process for sites like this typically would get through a public process with public meetings. And also, these sites also fall within our 2013 setback rules, which does also have additional notifications for residents between less than 1,000 feet away and opportunities for the public to meet with the operator and request to meet with the COGCC. And all of our permits have a public comment period. So, if it goes through, let's say, an administrative process at the local level, we still have, the requirements for the operator to engage in meetings as requested by the local government, and then we take the opportunity to receive public comments on all our permits. I think Kirby's over here saying we're probably getting short on time. One more question? Two more questions. Great.
Quick questions. We can try to do that.
Okay, so it's more of a comment. In the 4 years that I've been educated by oil and gas, I'd like to applaud the industry, the governments, for going out of their way to commingle with everybody. And I really appreciate having heat in my house and turning on the light switch and it works, and the luxuries that the oil and gas industry provides for the public. So thank you to the industry and the governments for doing what you guys do.
Thank you. Great question.
My question has to do with the LUMA. If today we're dealing with an oil developer and the site does not meet the criteria, but between now and the permitting process and everything else that goes on, a developer busily builds 22 units and now suddenly the site is a LUMA site, is there any tolling based on timing of application, et cetera, that stops the development of a LUMA?
So from the state's perspective, we actually count building units in platted developments if the development has started and there are homes built but they're not built. Let's say the homes above the road here were built, but the ones down by the field were not built, but they're platted. We would count those as building units. So we would be looking at platted under construction subdivisions. If it was platted, 20 years ago and nobody ever took action on it, then we wouldn't count those. But if someone's actively developing the property, then we can look at those.
How about unapproved PUDs? How do you handle, we'll call it urban, basically, encroachment?
So the question, and I'll just repeat it since you didn't have a mic, the question is how about handling undeveloped PUDs and urban encroachment. I mean, so as development comes towards oil and gas, if the site is already there, then that's completely a local land use process.
One of the other things, too, is that the LUMA rule actually provides in its exceptions oil and gas location areas that are within those planned PUDs as an exception to the LUMA process. So if there is, and I would say an approved PUD or a site-specific development plan that's approved at the time the LUMA permit would be going in, those are actually carved out of the rule because those would have already had to gone through the local permitting process. And so that would be deemed an exception only to the notice and consultation portion of the LUMA rule, but because those oil and gas locations have already been considered as part of those residential, commercial, or other planned developments.
Yeah, and the oil and gas development has to be included in that overall development plan.
Right.
Great. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.